Alrighty, folks, welcome back. Human development, a lifestyle, a lifespan view. Vail and Cavanaugh, chapter 4. All right, let's jump right in. Chapter 4, the emergence of thought and language, cognitive development in infancy and early childhood. Chapter objectives, describe Piaget's foundational concepts as well as his sensory motor and pre-operational stages. Describe the processes of attention and memory in infancy and toddlerhood. Describe Vygotsky's sociocultural perspective. Identify major language milestones occurring in infancy and toddlerhood. Okay, so Piaget, one of our main developmental theorists, we will be getting into some of his early stages of his theory in this chapter. Schemes, assimilation, and accommodation provide for the foundation of
One possibility I see is the shelter on East Congress Street in Detroit.
Whoops. How do schemes, assimilation, and accommodation provide the foundation for cognitive development throughout the lifespan? How does thinking become more advanced as infants progress through the sensory motor stage? What are the distinguishing characteristics of thinking during pre-operational stage, so pre-logical? Operation means logic. What are the strengths and weaknesses of Piaget's theories? How have contemporary researchers extended Piaget's theories? Okay, basic principle of cognitive development. Children are active scientists or explorers of their worlds. Children make sense of the world through schemes or mental categories of related events, objects, and knowledge. So this is what we start to build. A scheme is sort of like a concept, but maybe a little more broad, but they're could largely be interchangeable. Children adapt by refining their schemes and adding new ones, right? So we might have a scheme for what a parent is based on our parents, then you start to meet other parents, and then your scheme broadens, and then maybe you start to watch a TV show, and that changes your scheme a little bit, right? So your concept, your idea of what a household should look like, what a family should look like, it evolves over time, becomes more complex. Schemes change from physical to functional, conceptual, and abstract as the child develops. So broadly speaking, there are two things that can happen when we encounter new information. We can assimilate that new information to the schemes we already possess, or we can create new schemes through accommodation or modifying our schemes, current schemas. So, someone might have a certain political view, and they're taking information and they're sort of trying to fit that political view fit these facts into their political view, or it might be a religious view, or it might be a psychologist who has a certain idea about what theories are correct. And they're gathering data, and they're trying to kind of stuff that information into the current schemas, but it's just not fitting. There's unexplained things happening. Our current concepts can't explain it. And then finally it's like, okay, I got to reject this theory, and I have to, maybe it's I change religions, or maybe it's I'm leaving this political party, or maybe this thing I've thought that America was the source of all goodness in the world. Oh, maybe that's not true. Maybe we've done some bad things over the years, or maybe it's a scheme about myself. Maybe I learned that I'm a terrible person because my parent tells me I'm a terrible person constantly. Then I get older and I learn to expand my self-concept. I meet people who don't treat me badly, and I start to think differently about myself. So this is a kind of constant tug and pull, and our brain prefers assimilation, right? A term that's sometimes used in cognitive psychology is cognitive miser. We don't like to do things we don't have to do. So our brain always prefers to kind of do the minimum. So it'll always default to assimilation, but sometimes the facts our schemas just can't accommodate, and then we break through. Equilibration, is inadequate schemes are reorganized or replaced with more advanced or mature schemes. Equilibrium is a balance between assimilation and accommodation. This equilibrium is when we experience conflict between new information and existing concepts. Okay. So that looking at periods of cognitive development according to Piaget, we have the sensory motor period, birth to 2 years, pre-operational, 2 to 7, concrete operational, 7 to 11, and formal operational, 11 and up. Modern day developmental psychologists have added some new developmental schemes, new developmental stages after this one. All right, let's talk about sensory motor. It's deliberate, means end behavior, begins around 8 months of age. A lot of it is putting things into one's mouth. Object permanence refers to the idea that we know an object exists. So you hold up a cup and you put it behind your back. Does the child know that the cup still exists, right? According to Piaget, begins around 8 months, but not fully understood till 18 months. Although there's some more recent research suggests that's not true. Using symbols such as words, gestures occurs with toddlers 18 to 24 months. Can also anticipate consequences of actions instead of needing to experience them. Okay, some features of pre-operational thinking: egocentrism, so difficulty seeing the world from another's perspective. And interestingly, even adolescents struggle with this. So adolescents' IQ is fully developed, but they struggle with egocentrism. So they're not as good at certain cognitive tasks as adults are, even though their brains intellectually are fully developed. Animism, crediting inanimate objects with life and lifelike properties, rivers, trees, right? And so a lot of sort of early human culture is pre-operational, you might say. Centration, concentrating on only one facet of a problem to the neglect of other facets, interferes with conservation. Appearance is reality, assuming that an object is really what it appears. Okay. So what we'll do is, so here's an example of conservation. So children can easily guess that this is the same amount of water, but when you pour water from this tall glass into the shorter glass, children can't tell that it's the same amount of water, even though logically it would have to be because it was just poured, right? Same thing with the pennies. If you spread the top here, the pennies are spread evenly. Children judge them to be the same amount. Here, children will say there's more amount in the top row. Right? So there's a few different examples of this, and what we'll do is we'll watch a little video about it. So let's hop over here, fun little video. So note in this example, she is able to count. Like previously, a second ago, she did count 5 and 5, but here, so even though she has certain logical capacities, they sort of get overridden by this sort of immediate impulse to say larger is more, right? So she's kind of using certain basic rules like larger is more instead of logic, right? So this pre-operational, pre-logical thinking. Okay, that is pre-operational. So the next stage is concrete operational, and that's essentially being able to think logically about concrete objects, right? And then the stage after that is formal operational, being able to think logically about abstract concepts. Okay. So, evaluating Piaget's theory gives us some guidelines for fostering cognitive development, create environments where children can actively discover how the world works. Children profit from experience only when they can interpret their experience with their current cognitive structures. Help children actively discover inconsistencies in their thinkings. Some criticisms. It underestimates infants and young children's cognitive ability, overestimates adolescents' cognitive ability. So children, like the object permanence, it's been shown that he was wrong about that. Children understand that. Even infants understand that better than he thought. It's vague about mechanisms and processes for change. It does not account for variability in children's performance. And it undervalues the sociocultural environment that influence cognitive development. Okay, so if we talk about extending Piaget's theory, what can we say? So children develop specialized theory about much narrower areas than Piaget suggested. So that would be called the core knowledge hypothesis. Infants understand basic things like physics and biology kind of in a naive way earlier than he thought. And 4-year-olds understand specific properties of living things. So kind of there's some sort of built-in things that Piaget didn't understand, right? And sort of the way that human brains work and the way that human brains are prepared to understand the world via evolution. All right, information processing during early infancy and early childhood. What is the basis of the information processing approach? How well do young children pay attention? What kinds of learning take place during infancy? Do infants and preschool children remember? What do infants and preschoolers know about numbers? General principles of information processing. It's a view that mental development involves changes in mental hardware and software. So the mental hardware are basically the neurons, the structures in the brain. And the mental software, these programs or schemas allowing for these could be programs, these could be like sort of genetic programs, things we were born with, or they could be schemas that we learn. Attention is when sensory information receives additional cognitive processing, right? So our brains are constantly scanning the environment. Attention is essentially when we focus in on one particular object in the environment to process that information more carefully. Compared to older children, preschoolers are less able to pay attention to task relevant information. Children's attention can be improved through pretend play. So you can maybe get a child to pay more attention if you make it fun and make it a game. Orienting response, emotional and physical reactions to unfamiliar stimulus. Habituation is lessened reactions to stimulus after repeated presentation. So if you show a child a puppet for the first time, they're going to be very interested. You do it 100 times, they're going to be less interested. Learning, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. I think we talked about this a little bit last week. If you do not understand these terms very well, I'd recommend you watching a video. I won't go into them, but learning is a big part of this, and a large chunk of learning happens through these processes of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Okay, so talking about memory, Collier's experiments reveal that 3 important features of memory exist in infants. An event from the past is remembered. Over time, the event can no longer be recalled. A cue can serve to reactivate a memory that seems to have been forgotten. So those are basic features of memory in adults as well, but also present in infants. Age-related improvements in memory can be traced in part to growth in the brain regions that support memory. The hippocampus and the amygdala develop early. The hippocampus is the primary sort of memory center, but it works with the amygdala. The amygdala is our emotion center of our brain. So traumatic events or very positive events. Really anything with a lot of emotion is going to tend to be remembered better. That makes sense, right? If something's very fearful, we need to remember it so we can avoid that dangerous situation. If something's really good, we need to remember it so we can get more of that thing in the future. Our frontal cortex, stuff up here, it's the most human part of our brain. It develops in our second year. Toddlers begin retrieving information from long-term memories. That's kind of, the thing that makes us as humans separates us from other animals. That stuff starts to come along, and you can see that like other mammals can really function kind of at the toddler level, essentially cognitively. We're talking about birds or dogs, things like that. It's kind of that second year and beyond where humans start to pull ahead of other animals. Autobiographical memory in preschoolers exists for significant events in one's past, appears as a sense of self emerges. Children's autobiographical memories are richer when parents talk about past events. Preschoolers as eyewitnesses, they're vulnerable to suggestion and leading questions. All humans are. Elizabeth Loftus's famous Lost at the Mall study, where she convinced adults that they had gotten lost at the mall as children, and they just kind of went along with it and started making stuff up. So leading questions can get anyone to have false memories, certainly children. Children's accuracy of recall improves when they're interviewed very soon after the event, when they're encouraged to tell the truth and told that it's okay to say, I don't know, when nonverbal cues are avoided by the interviewer, and when they're asked questions allowing for alternate explanations of the event. Infants are able to distinguish small quantities. 5-month-olds have basic number skills, right? So numbers are one of those things that children gradually learn. 1, 2, 3, then 10, 20, 30, gradually it's like hundreds, thousands. Preschoolers have mastered 3 principles when applied to 5 objects or fewer: the one-to-one principle, the stable order principle, and the cardinality principle. 5-year-olds use these principles regarding 9 or fewer objects. Right? So just sort of basic principles of numbers, like cardinality is like ordering of things, that things don't necessarily change order. They're supposed to be in a certain order. Things can match up and they're supposed to be paired, things like that. Okay, so now getting into a little bit more nuanced theory of cognitive development. Piaget's theory is basically like, all right, here's these 4 stages, all children do them. They're sort of very abstract. Vygotsky's theory is a bit more nuanced, a bit more in the weeds. He's talking about children as sort of apprentices, how they're learning their cultural roles as one of the main cognitive tasks. What does it mean to be a man or a woman, a mother or a father, or to work in a coal mine, or to work as a teacher or a firefighter, or whatever it might be? All these different things children are learning from their parents, from television, from social media now, especially. Okay. What is the zone of proximal development? How does it help explain how children accomplish more when they collaborate with others? Why is scaffolding a particularly effective way of teaching youngsters new concepts and skills? When and why do children talk to themselves as they solve problems? All right, Vygotsky's mind and culture theory. Intersubjectivity. All participants have a mutual shared understanding of an activity. Game rules. Guided participation. These are just some kind of concepts that his theory is made up of. Refers to cognition develops via structured activities with more skilled learners. Apprenticeship, the process during which a skilled master teaches a skill or task to a less skilled apprentice, such as a child. So a big part of his theory is this idea of scaffolding, that you have a skilled master who's like the parent and the apprentice is the child, and the parent has some skill, and whether maybe it's as simple as opening a bottle or stacking up some blocks. And the zone of proximal development is an activity that the child is able to learn with help, right? So there's activities a child can't learn even with help. There's activities a child can learn by themselves, but then there's those activities that the child can learn, but only with help. And that's how you really accelerate a child's development, is by constantly keeping them in that zone of proximal development. It's sort of almost like putting you've maybe seen a picture of like a man riding a donkey holding a stick with a carrot dangling, and the donkey's kind of moving forward towards the carrot. You're kind of pulling that child forward into new skills and abilities by giving them things that they can't do by themselves, but they could do with help. And that pushes their development further and more quickly than if they were doing it on their own. Another concept from Vygotsky is called private speech, which is talking to oneself to guide behavior and self-regulate. Speech is audible but isn't directed at others, nor is it intended for others to hear. Later, this just becomes silent. In its most mature form, inner speech is unintelligible to all but the thinker and does not resemble spoken language. I don't experience that, but some people maybe do. People experience their internal world very differently. Some people, it's all words. Some people, it's all images and no words. That's different neurotypes in that regard. Okay, language. When do infants first hear and make speech sounds? When do children start to talk? How do young children learn grammar? And how well do youngsters communicate? So the left hemisphere of the newborn's brain is most sensitive to speech. Babies prefer to listen to speech over complex non-speech sounds. Babies can distinguish consonant sounds as well as vowels. Infants can even hear phonemes that are not used in their native language, but this ability is lost by their first birthday. So, for example, in the Japanese language, the ra sound essentially is pronounced la. There is no ra, there's only la. So adult Japanese people can't make that R sound, but infants can hear that, whereas adult Japanese people can't hear that. It's not just that they can't make it, they hear the ra as a la. This stuff tells us that our brain is born prepared for speech. That is one of the fundamental kind of aspects of our species. Infants use many powerful tools to identify words in speech. They pay more attention to words used repeatedly. They pay more attention to stressed syllables than unstressed syllables. So, baby talk, when parents talk very slowly to their children, and they might modify their tone of voice to draw their attention, right? That type of stuff is going to get their attention. It's going to help them learn those syllables and those phonemes. Infant-directed speech refers to adults' speech to infants, slower with greater variation in pitch and loudness. This is not baby talk. Similar types of simple speech are used across culture. It attracts infants' attention more than adult-directed speech. Infant-directed speech helps infants perceive fundamental sounds. So this stuff is good, but where I say it's not baby, this is not baby talk. Meaning baby talk is sometimes like when you mispronounce things on purpose. That's not good, right? So including variation in pitch and loudness is good. That does help a baby. Mispronouncing things is not good. You'll just teach them how to say things wrong. Step to speech. At 2 months, infants begin cooing. 6 months, they begin babbling. 8 to 11 months, children incorporate intonation or changes in pitch, typical of the language they hear. But again, some children are talking, maybe not full sentences, but they do start to use words at this age. So again, always variation. Grand insight, words as symbols. Before 12 months, infants use symbols in areas other than language. Infants will gesture, and young infants can actually be taught sign language. So you can teach an infant to do this. Every time you feed an infant milk, if you do this, the infant will start to do that when it wants some water or some milk or some food. So infants younger than speaking age can use symbols. It's just learning to produce those sounds takes time, takes longer than simple hand gestures. 12 to 18 months, children learn that words are symbols for objects, actions, properties, first words, many more. Early on, children appear to understand the speech of others but do not speak themselves. Around 1 year, children use their first words, usually consonant vowel pairs such as dada or wawa. Dada is often the most common word. It's very easy. By 2 years, ta, da, da, ta, ta. It's very common. By 2 years, children have a vocabulary of a few hundred words. By 6, it's about 10,000 words. At approximately 18 months, children begin experiencing an explosive rate of word learning. Fast mapping refers to rapid connection between new words and their exact references. Factors contributing to rapid learning: joint attention, constraints on word names, sentence cues, cognitive factors, shifts from attentional cues to language and social cues, naming errors. All right, so there's two kinds of naming errors as all this stuff is happening. One is underextension, one is overextension. So using a term too narrowly, right? So maybe you teach a child that their family dog is a dog, but it doesn't realize that other dogs are also dogs. Or you teach a child the word for dog for the family dog, and it thinks that cats are also dogs. Individual differences in word learning. Huge individual differences. At 18 months, vocabularies range from 25 to 250. That is because children's vocabulary is greater for those with better memory and greater for those exposed to a richer learning environment. The amount of words that a child is exposed to is a really powerful predictor of cognitive development in the future. So talking to your child, reading to your child, any interaction is very powerful. And the converse of that, especially parents that tend to be poorer, maybe they're working more, there's more stress, they're paying less attention, that dramatically affects the child's cognitive development. Bilingualism, when compared with monolingual children, bilingual children show smaller vocabularies for each language, but greater total vocabulary, better understanding of words and arbitrary symbolic nature, greater skill at switching across tasks, better ability to inhibit inappropriate responses. So these are very powerful abilities, right? The ability to inhibit an inappropriate response, the ability to control our own emotions, to regulate our own emotions is one of the most powerful predictors of success in life. And it has a strong association with bilingualism, which is interesting, although somewhat unexplained at this point. Word learning styles, two distinct styles of word learning, but most children blend them. There's the referential style, which is kind of intellectual emphasis. I mean, vocabularies consist mainly of words naming objects, persons, or actions. They can consist of few social interaction words or question words, whereas the other is more socially oriented. But obviously, children are going to be learning both. Encouraging language growth. Parents can assist in learning language by speaking to children, naming objects, showing a child an object repeatedly until they learn it, then moving on to a new object. Providing TV programs that emphasize word learning. I mean, TV is not great, but some TV is better than others. Touchscreen tablets and smartphone apps can increase language skills when they require active engagement. I would not recommend, I would not include that in I guess you could say some apps are better than others, but at this point, the recommendation for children should be do not let them in front of a screen. Avoid as much as possible. Speaking in sentences, grammatical development, around 18 months, 2 and 3 word sentences based on simple formulas like action, verb, actor verb, noun verb, or noun verb object. Mom, picked up the phone, or mom threw ball, or something, dad threw ball. They can reflect telegraphic speech, exclude grammatical morphemes. By preschool, show growing knowledge of grammatical rules instead of just simple memory, and they reflect over-regularization errors, sort of applying one rule to a lot of circumstances. Many languages are much more regular than English, so that's more a problem in English than other languages. How do children acquire grammar? Well, the linguist answer is innate neural mechanisms guide the learning of grammar. There's something that's hypothesized called a universal grammar. It's the idea that our brains are basically, so it was essentially discovered that all languages have the same sort of basic structures, and therefore hypothesized that there must be sort of basic learning structures in the brain. The cognitive answer would be detection of patterns and irregularities, and then the creation of rules. Social interaction answer, eclectic integration of behavioral, linguistic, and cognitive solutions, plus accurate communication. So really all three of these are, we do have innate mechanisms, parts of our brain specifically dedicated to hearing and producing speech. But these other things are part of the picture as well. If children aren't spoken to, they may never learn to speak. So there's been examples of children that were actually found who were raised by animals, or a couple girls that were found in India who were raised by wolves. There's been some famous cases of very, very severe abuse, and the children don't necessarily learn to speak the way they normally would, and maybe not at all if they're not spoken to at a young age. Communicating with others. Effective communication requires making sure to speak in a language the listener understands, calibrating messages depending on the audience, paying attention while listening, taking turns as speaker and listener. Before 2 years, conversational turn-taking encouraged and often modeled by parents. After 2 years, spontaneous turn-taking common between children and adults. Here's some major milestones. Birth to 1 year, babies hear phonemes from birth. They begin to coo between 2 and 4, then babble at 6, begin to talk and gesture about their first birthday. 1 to 3, vocabulary expands rapidly, particularly at about 18 months. 2-word sentences emerge. Telegraphic speech at 18 months, more complex sentences at 3 years. Turn taking evident in communication by about 2 years. Again, wide variety. 3 to 5 years, vocabulary continues to expand. Grammatical morphemes are added, and children begin to adjust their speech to listeners, but as listeners, they often ignore problems in messages they receive. Okay, summary. Now that the lesson has ended, you should have learned how to describe Piaget's foundational concepts, as well as his sensory motor and pre-operational stages. Describe the processes of attention and memory in infancy and toddlerhood. Describe Vygotsky's sociocultural perspective. Identify major language milestones occurring in infancy and toddlerhood. All right, folks. That will do it for chapter 4. And we'll see you all next.